Thanks, Emily. So I'm going to start talking while Doug is setting up. So I want to share a story about why I love SIGGRAPH, because it just happened this morning at the coffee shop. So I was standing in line, and as you know, it takes about 30 minutes at Italy to get a coffee. And there's this older gentleman in front of me who kind of leans back and he's like, hey, what are you here for? And I was like, oh, I'm here for a computer conference. And I'm like trying to explain to him computer graphics, all this kind of thing. And he's like, where do you work? So I work at Autodesk. Oh, do you know Carl Bass? I was like, oh yeah, he's our previous CEO. Yeah, he was my student. So then I realized I'm talking to Don Greenberg, right? So this is kind of cool because it goes back to, David Morin's thing at the beginning when you're looking at like the history and the connections and all that, and he's kind of all of our grandfather, right? He's kind of the beginning of computer graphics, or one of the beginnings. So for me, that was super cool to see him. Anyway, so I'm sort of the appetizer before the real meal that Doug is going to talk about. Hopefully I'm not overpriced like most appetizers are. But what I want to talk about is a little bit, how do we think about open source inside a software vendor, right? Because ultimately we are selling software, we have to make money, but we are also really big open source contributors. So like, how do we think about that? What are the decisions we make? How do we kind of evaluate those things? So that's what I'm going to start with very quickly, and then Doug is going to get into some of the other things. So I think actually the more important part is I'm going to go through 4 examples. And so I think the first question is, why should we give away proprietary code, right? Like we've kind of paid people to develop these things. Why just give that away? And I think David kind of talked about it a little bit this morning. But for me, there's a point where the differentiation of what you have is no longer valuable enough for selling that thing. And you have to kind of find like where's that fine line, and how do you support community? How do you support your customers? How do you build all these things to be interoperable and portable and all that? And I think those kind of non-monetary things weigh very heavily when we make these decisions, because I think that's really, really important. Another thing that comes up is, well, why would you give money? Okay, so it's fine, I understand you're paying developers, and I kind of get the whole open source thing, but why would you pay the Linux Foundation, or the Academy Software Foundation, or why would you pay to join AOUSD, or even the Cronus Group? And for that, there's actually a lot of really good reasons for a software company that are maybe not as obvious to everybody. The first one is you have this continuous integration, continuous delivery system that's kind of maintained for you. That's like hugely important, right? It means that we know that all of these projects are being tested, like everything's being run all the time. It's a good infrastructure. We can depend on it. Super important. But actually more important than that for us as a software company is the governance model and all of the legal framework behind it. Right, so we really have to worry about if we're putting something in a product that we're selling to somebody, we need to make sure that all of those CLAs were signed, like all those different things. Like that's actually really, really important. And it can get us in big trouble if ever that's not kind of done well. And so this is where something like the Academy Software Foundation is great for us, because there's like a very well-established legal framework that allows us to trust that we can use these things, they're fine, we can contribute things, we have that kind of the right backing for how do we contribute, and we know that anybody else that has contributed has followed that same pattern. So that's really, really important. And then why do we pay staff for contributing directly to ASWF projects directly? First of all, to me, just it feels like the right thing to do. But ultimately, these are things that we would have to write anyway, right? Like if we're depending on the project, it means we would have had to create it in the first place. And that comes back to that first comment I was making about, when is it differentiating versus is kind of the stuff you need, right? Like that 80% I think David was referring to this morning with the internet. There's a lot of value in that 20% that's not common. That's kind of where you want to live, and you want to make sure that that 80% is really well supported and kind of keeps going. So I'll move on to my next slide. So how do you measure contributions? We're kind of thinking about money and that kind of thing. I'm one of the people that's not a fan of the slide that David showed this morning, and he knows that we've talked about it. And the reason is, I think evaluating contributions or code or things like that is really, really complicated, right? If we look at that, what was the model called? Kokomo, I think. If you look at that model as an example, somebody who does an amazing refactoring that does it in one pull request and removes 3,000 lines of code, that's a negative contribution in that model, right? But it's actually an amazing contribution for the history of a project. Right, so these are things where I think we need to find the more valuable things when we're talking to executives, because sometimes when we look at these metrics, like we all kind of understand, oh yeah, but like lines of code is not really a good metric, or like pull requests is not a good metric, like time, is an hour of Larry Gritz's time the same value as the hour of an intern's time? In some cases, yes, in other cases, no, right? So there's things where there's context, there's dependencies, we kind of need to be careful about that. And I think the problem is when you start talking to executives and they look at these charts, they don't know those things. So they just see bar charts and whatever, and they're like, well, hey, we're 5th in this list. Why are we still contributing? Like, we're obviously not getting value out of this, right? So that's something that we kind of struggle with, or I struggle with internally when I'm talking to seniors to say, like, how do I get funding to keep doing these things? Because I know they're the right things to do, but I still need to make sure that we can keep doing that. And I think in terms of measuring the value, for me, one of the top ones is the developers who work on open source projects are happy, right? Like, they really enjoy it. There's a lot of sort of just employee engagement for people who are working on open source projects. And the other thing, which was a little bit of a surprise to me, but it makes total sense in retrospect, is the more that we had an open source presence, the more we had people coming to want to work for us, right? Because they saw what we were doing. They're like, I want to do that, right? So it made it a lot easier for recruiting and stuff like that. And so I think that's a really nice kind of knock-on effect that maybe was not intentional when we were thinking about this originally. All right, so I'm going to go quickly. Doug, I'm stealing too much of your time. Maybe I won't go through all 4 of these projects. I'm going to go through a few of them anyway. And I want to talk about, like, what were we thinking internally when we kind of looked at each of these individual projects. So the first one is OpenColor.io. And I think this one is probably, it's kind of like our teenage years in terms of open source mentality. And I think that we kind of, we became a young adult going through this process of OpenColor.io. And the reason I say that is I kind of want to point out that we had to learn a lot in how we interacted with the community. And so I think most of you probably know the history of OpenColor.io. Obviously it was great. It was used in a lot of places, but it was kind of dormant. It didn't have maintainers. We at Autodesk had internal technology, which we believe was a bit superior at the time, but it only worked in our products, right? So it worked in Maya, it worked in Flame, but ultimately that didn't really help our customers because they're using Houdini, they're using Nuke, they're using a bunch of other things in their pipelines, and they're all saying to us, well, we want to be able to use these kind of standard things. And so internally we had to make that evaluation of, is it really, like that proprietary thing I was talking about before, is it differentiating? Is it making us better? Well, if our customers can't use it, then the answer is no, right? Like, we're not helping. And this is where we kind of had that internal light bulb moment where we realized we need to open source this. Like, we need to make this part of how do we move forward to have this kind of common project for an important thing like color management. So that's kind of step 1. We made the decision. Step 2 is we had to approach the community. Now remember, back then in those days, Autodesk was probably not known as much as we are today for our open source contributions. And so people would look at us coming in and saying, hey, we want to help out, we want to contribute to OCIO, and they're like, well, why? What's your ulterior motive? Like, what are you going to break? Are you going to keep the APIs the same? Like, it's all that kind of thing, right? And it was really kind of difficult for people to understand, no, like, we actually just want to make this thing better. We want to breathe new life into it. It's important for us and our products as much as it is for our competitors' products. And ultimately, our customers are using all of those things, right? So that was kind of the thing that we had to go through. And I think because of that social nature of, it really was a social problem, right? We were working with people who were kind of previous maintainers, who were maybe a little hesitant of us and what we wanted to do. We were probably not explaining ourselves very well at the beginning because we had to learn, like, how do you do this dance? But I think we learned a ton, and I think the project is much better for it. And we now consume it in all of our products. It's obviously consumed in a lot of other products. It's won tremendous number of awards. I think Doug was telling me we've won another award this week for, well, I say we as us as ASWF have won an award recently this week. And so I think it's kind of a nice success story because it was challenging for us internally, first just to make the decision. It was challenging for us to figure out, like, how do we work on this together? It was challenging sometimes when we would have something that we thought, like, this is a good pull request, but it would take months to get it through for various reasons that aren't worth getting into. But those are good things, right? Like, we needed to kind of learn going along those stages. So I think that's our teenage years. Our young adult years, I would say, is Material X. So in the case of Material X, oh, sorry, I guess we went to sleep. That's my son, I'm talking way too long. Oops. Well, anyway, we all saw the logos. In the case of Material X, the thing that was interesting here is we had made a decision internally. We had too many viewports at Autodesk, basically, and we had too many ways to go from a shading model to how do you display this thing in a viewport. So we were kind of solving that problem internally. At the same time, Lucasfilm were solving the other half of that problem. So without getting into too many details, since I've been talking too long already, I think the really interesting thing here was we worked with a customer to say, like, hey, together we have this thing that might be super useful for the industry. Like, should we both be maybe putting this together and open sourcing it together, so that it can continue to grow and kind of nurture? And that was easier because we had this foundation already of having done this before, right? So we knew internally how to talk to the kind of business sponsors within Autodesk. We knew how to talk to Lucasfilm about it. We knew how to open source this together. Like, it worked well together, and I think that's kind of a nice example, and I think it's doing really well. I'll talk about the Open Review Initiative, and I'll skip Open PBR, just because I'm stealing too much of your time, Doug, and I apologize. But I think the Open Review Initiative is an interesting one, again, looking at the internal and external politics and sort of the decision making. So when the Open Review Initiative started up, a lot of people were privately looking at me saying, RV, like, it needs to be in that thing. Like, why is it not there? And we were participating, but we were never saying, yes, we will put RV into the mix. And the reason for that is, this time around, it was actually a lot easier internally to make the decision. Like, is it the right thing to do or not? And the answer was yes, it's the right thing to do. The thing that made it more complicated was it's a whole product, right? So it's a whole product. It has a whole support chain. It has all the licensing commitments, it has sales commitments, it has contracts, like, there's a whole bunch of things around it, and it has proprietary codecs inside it. So how do we deal with this notion of taking an entire product versus a contribution and making that part of something and kind of open sourcing it? And so I think that one was kind of new for us because it was the first time it was an entire product. And because of that, we were a little bit later than I would have liked for us to get that into that Open Review Initiative, as it was forming. But it was kind of interesting where inside Autodesk, we all understood, like, yes, this is the right thing to do, but we still kind of had these stumbling blocks where we had to go through legal and spend a lot of time kind of reviewing a bunch of different things. And also figuring out, how do you separate out the pieces that we really just can't open source because we don't even own them? Like, like a codec, for example, we license to sell, but we can't include that in an open source thing. So how do we make sure that a customer who also has a license for that can go ahead and use it? So I think it was really interesting. And I think now OpenRV is kind of alive and healthy, and we have a lot of people who are cloning it, and we get a lot of pull requests from it. And I highly encourage you actually to watch, if there's a recording. I don't know if there is, but last year Guillaume Brassard gave a talk about some of the architectural things and why it was a nice fit and all that kind of stuff. So I don't want to talk about that. It's more just kind of the decision-making process internally about why this one was kind of new for us as well. And so I think these are all kind of like different examples of things. And I would say that OpenPBR is kind of along that same spectrum, but I'm going to stop there. And I'm going to hand it over to your actual meal, which is Doug, who's going to talk about all these crazy interviews he did. So Doug spent the last month talking to 48 different people, asking them about working on open source projects and what it means to them and stuff like that. And so I'm looking forward to hearing what they said.
Thank you. Thank you, Eric. Good morning, everyone. So the author, Jean Le Carré, once wrote that a desk is a dangerous place from which to view the world. And with that in mind, and with our goal of trying to figure out how to improve the process of open source development in a corporate setting like Autodesk, I thought it would be interesting to go out and talk with a lot of my colleagues and hear directly from them what they think is working well, what areas are challenging. And so I reached out to 4 people who are working with either ASWF projects or OpenUSD to hear directly from them, their stories. And so that's what I'd like to share with you today. I spoke with a variety of different roles, so mostly developers, but also people who are doing product management, product owners, development managers, executives, architects, so forth, both in the M&E group and in other parts of Autodesk. After the interview, I did a survey to collect a few more pieces of information. One was like, how much time do you spend a week working either as a contributor or as someone who's integrating ASWF or OpenUSD into our products? And there's a wide range from people who just spend an hour per week up through people who are working full-time. About a quarter of the group is spending more than half their time on these projects, either as a contributor or integrator. The median was about 1 day a week. Diversity is something that's important. At the ASWF, we have a great D&I working group led by Carol Payne and Rachel Rose. It's also something that Eric and I are interested in, and so we wanted to measure the diversity of the group that we spoke with. Not that we expected to learn anything new. We kind of already knew that we have a lot of work to do in this area, but we felt it was important to at least measure it, because if you're not measuring it, it's difficult to improve. And one of the just very basic things is, well, what questions you put on a survey. And so, one of the goals is you'd like something that you can track over time and that you can compare to surveys that other people are doing. So we use these three questions are ones that the Linux Foundation is also using. And of course, as long as we were doing a survey, we're curious what text editors people are using. Visual Studio Code is doing well at the moment. So Autodesk transitioned to agile development many years ago, and you may be familiar with, there's something called a maturity curve that's associated with agile. It's a measure of how far an organization is in terms of adopting agile methodologies, and you can kind of think of open source in a similar way, where there's a curve that you go up starting with just a user of open source and then gradually contributing more until you're an active contributor. And as Eric said, we've put a lot of effort into developing our open source muscle. And so, we have, for people who just want to use open source, we have things like the pre-approved license list, where legal has said you don't need further approval to use these licenses in our products. There's guidance for people who want to make something that they're working on open source, although it's still up to the individual projects to some extent to kind of, once it's out in the open, to sort of coordinate how it's run. And as I was talking with people, I found a few gaps that I'm hoping that we can address as part of our participation in the Dev Days event this fall, around making people aware of the contributor license arrangements for various projects, making it easy, just kind of reducing the friction to get involved and contribute. And one of the things that I found encouraging was, as I talked with people and said, so when you make bug fixes, when you make improvements, is the first instinct to push that back upstream? And I was encouraged to hear that yes, that for most people that's the case, and it's been a huge transition. So it's much improved even over the last 5 years at Autodesk. So one of the things that I learned as I spoke with people, and this sort of matches my own impression, is that open source development yields generally a higher quality result, but it takes longer to get there. So it's better because you have more people looking at it, people with a variety of different perspectives. But if you compare it to internal development, like internally, if a developer makes a PR, generally they get a code review within a day, and within a few days it's merged. In open source, that's rarely the case, and on some projects, some of the people I spoke with were telling me about cases where they've spent a year waiting for PRs to be merged. As someone who's a maintainer on the OCIO side, I definitely empathize with the challenge that the projects are faced with, because it's difficult to sync people's availability for things coming in. Like, the person who's an expert in this part of the code may not be available right then to review it. So, I mean, for the people I spoke with, it was viewed as sort of an acceptable trade-off, but there is a big cost associated with it. And I should point out, a lot of these slides are kind of talking about challenges of open source development. I don't want it to come off as negative, because we are big proponents of open source, but it's just sort of the nature of the questions that I was asking people. I really wanted to know, what are you struggling with? Tell me, what are the things that you think need to be improved? And so that's sort of reflected in a lot of the things that I'm going to be talking about. So one of these that's a good example is planning. So particularly when I spoke with people who are doing release planning for various products, they talked about the fact that it's difficult because a lot of these open source projects, they don't have good roadmaps. So it's very difficult to plan and figure out what are we going to have in the next release if we're not sure, what the development schedule is. And again, as someone who's a contributor to OpenColor.io, I can definitely relate to that because the projects, we don't necessarily know what contributions are going to be coming in advance. We don't have control over the contributors' time, so even if we say this is something that we'd like to implement, we don't necessarily have the staff to do that. So it's very challenging, but at the same time, I think it's possible that we could make more progress. For example, we could at least make the in-progress work less opaque to observers, and that's something that Carol and I have been talking about in terms of OpenColor.io, and we want to work on that this year. If people are interested in comparing notes, please reach out to Carol or I. Another thing that I wanted to do was talk to people who are working on open source projects that are tightly coupled with the commercial products. And so Maya USD is an example of this. This is the plugin that implements USD support in Maya. Arnold has a similar plugin, OpenRV that Eric mentioned. These are all things that are developed in the open on GitHub. And I was interested to learn more about how the process is going. The people I spoke with enjoyed the direct collaboration with customers. It's very different from, like, we already have existing mechanisms. Like, we have beta programs for the various products. We have support, so developers and so forth are always helping the support group. So this is like a different method of interacting, and it's a more direct way that people have enjoyed, but it's also not without cost. So you have this presence on GitHub. You want to make the open source project successful. You have issues coming in all the time. It takes work to triage all the different, bug reports, help requests, feature requests. Our QA staff has helped with that, but the developers are directly involved as well, and it has an impact, of course, on the velocity of whatever the main feature that they're working on at the time. And there are other challenges around syncing. Various teams have explored better ways to sync our internal Jira system that we use for development to GitHub. So the bottom line is it's not just about putting the code out on GitHub. It's really a matter of thinking through this sort of collaborative development model and staffing it accordingly so that the project can be successful. On the subject of staffing, one of the things that I think is interesting is if you compare the way like a commercial product is developed, the developers are surrounded by people who are helping make them more productive. And if you compare that to a typical open source project, it's staffed just by developers who are also doing documentation, they're triaging bugs, they're doing all of these other things. And the Linux Foundation does help with this somewhat. The ASWF projects are all using the CI system, like the CI working group led by Jeff Panacea has been super helpful. Emily has been super helpful on marketing and raising awareness of the other projects. But still, I think the projects could be a lot more productive if we had documentation support, QA support, project management support. And so with Dev Days coming up, I thought it would be interesting to try to challenge ourselves to see, like, how can we get people who are not just developers, but working in these other roles to try to get involved with the projects. One of the things that came up repeatedly is this so-called versionitis problem. And there's a lot of different aspects to that. The VFX reference platform certainly helps, but it's not a silver bullet because we're simultaneously supporting a range of versions. So like Maya USD, for example, every month and a half on their GitHub releases page, they publish 9 different installers. So Linux, Mac, Windows times 3 different Maya releases, 2022, 2023, 2024. These have different USD, they're based on different USD releases. Some of them have bug fixes or security patches on top of them. So it's complicated to manage that. It's complicated to find, like something like Maya uses a lot of these open source projects. They all have common dependencies. Finding the right version that works across all of the different ASWF projects and USD is a challenge. Wanted to give a shout out to an initiative from Larry last year to put together a VFX industry build matrix that tries to get at this question of what releases are currently being used. Because that temporal aspect is a big part of the complexity, as is backwards compatibility. So a lot of the ASWF projects and USD are still, they haven't had their 1.0 release yet. So changes that may be made on the project side may seem insignificant, but for us with commercial products where backwards compatibility is very important, that sometimes we may need to delay picking up an update from them until a major version release on our side due to backwards compatibility. So one of the things that, here's a couple of other miscellaneous things that came up a lot in conversations. So documentation, these are complex projects. It's not like a commercial SDK where they have paid staff writing documentation. And for things like Autodesk is contributing a lot to Hydra, which is part of OpenUSD, and contributing web support, DX support, improved Vulkan support, and a number of people said it's a really steep learning curve, and documentation is something that is still a lot of people are asking for. Interop is also something that's on people's minds constantly, and so more test files, either from the projects themselves or from great initiatives like the ASWF's Digital Production Example Library, are very appreciated. One of the things that would help with regard to these files also is to document the assets thoroughly, so that there's documentation so that it says like which version of various file formats or schemas are being used, so that it's less effort to sort of reverse engineer what a given asset involves. So as Eric said, when I asked people if they enjoyed working on open source projects, the result was unanimously yes. These are some of the quotes that I got. People are really liking it, and a number of people said they're looking forward to the ASWF developer days that I mentioned to them. So as I spoke with people in leadership, it was unambiguous that open source is viewed as strategically important to us. And although we're still working on a lot of aspects of our progress up the maturity curve, I think we're making good progress from this sort of user mindset to being an active contributor. And part of that is recognizing that there are differences between open source development and traditional development that need to be accommodated for, and so one of the things that, because there is this trade-off, like there's benefits, but there's also definitely costs. One of the things I asked developers was, has it been worth it? Like, do you wish you could just go back to doing internal development? Is this whole thing worth it? And net, it was clear that people liked the open source approach, that the benefits far outweigh the drawbacks. And so that was definitely encouraging to hear as well. So my last slide, in the survey that I did, I asked people, so could you give me 3 words that describe, that you associate with the ASWF? And this is the word cloud that came back, and you can see the community was the thing that people cited most often, and that sort of echoed the conversations that I had. It's clear that the staff at Autodesk definitely values the community that has been created around the ASWF, not only in terms of a place to discuss like the detailed technical issues around each of the projects, but also as a place where we can discuss the larger issues that are facing the industry in terms of how we can move faster and how we can collaborate better. So that concludes our talk. Thank you.
minutes for Q&A.
Do people have questions? For Eric or myself?
Not really a question, but maybe an observation and a request for the ASWF more generally. But it's really interesting findings. It'd be great to see a broader survey across, lots of companies who are contributing, as well as, both on the vendor side, but also on the studio side, the contributor side.
Yeah, definitely. And the ASWF has been doing surveys, but yeah, it's definitely important to track and measure progress over time.
Yes, Brian, we'll definitely share the questions with Emily.
Hey, excellent presentation, both of you. You listed a bunch of challenges there, but you didn't list any recommendations. You talked about community is the number one thing from ASWF. Here's a community of people that could help fix some of those challenges, like connections to GitHub and Jira. Are there suggestions or ways that you think that ASWF could help make that better?
Well, yeah, a lot of these challenges are sort of endemic to open source development. They're not necessarily specific to the ASWF or OpenUSD. And so some of the things that I mentioned in terms of like coming up with better roadmaps, putting more emphasis on speed of pull requests are things that I think are basic things. They're not going to change overnight, but yeah, a lot of this was really more about kind of reporting what people think are the challenges. A lot of these problems are difficult to solve, and I wish I had better solutions. But the main goal was just to kind of share what we found.
Yeah, so I think I'll add, so Darren, I feel like, again, if we think about this maturity model, I think the ASWF is kind of, we're growing, we're aging, we're getting more mature, and I think the next thing is really about how do we purposefully plan where these things are going. And I think it's complicated because if you look at the membership that we have, we are made up of kind of software companies, studios, and then other things. And just looking at software companies and studios, they have different goals, they have different drivers, they have different schedules, they have different periods of mayhem and crazy and whatever. And I think that's where we have to get that planning to that next level where that becomes part of the priority for both, right? So that a commitment to something that's coming from a studio or from a software company has the same kind of level of priority regardless of what's happening in their local environments. And I think that's part of that maturity, where it's planned into whatever we're doing. And I don't think we're there yet. But I think that would be a cool next step.
Hi. I guess along the same lines, I wonder, historically, traditionally, open source work is like a labor of love. Going back to Clay Shirky's talk from a zillion years ago, that love internet style. As you go to this model, are you thinking that this open source, or there's this ASWF and a bunch of contributors, it's going to go more to, it's not just love, but this is an actual commitment that you're doing to your roadmap? And if it's less of a labor of love, is that going to start reducing some of the joy that the developers have in being part of it?
Oh, I definitely hope it doesn't reduce the joy. I think people have really been enjoying the project, and so even for people who are paid to do this as part of their job, they're enjoying the sort of interaction that you get with other people in the industry. And I think that's where a lot of the joy comes from, and it's something that I think is, applies equally to people who are being paid to do it as part of their job, as much as people who are working on weekends. A lot of us do spend, for those of us who are leading some of these ASWF projects, we definitely are spending nights and weekends working on this as a labor of love as well. So I think those two things are mutually compatible, but the interesting thing from the corporate point of view is how do you integrate it into the systems that exist at some place like Autodesk, where they have a long history of doing commercial product development, and how do you sort of leverage the skills and methodologies that are come into play into making that process as efficient as possible.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. I saw the hand back there.
So one of the things you mentioned was the difference in time to process a pull request for an internal in-house project being a few days and then for an external submission being much, much longer. And that sort of reflects the in-house priorities being, put above the outside community. So how do you get your corporate entity to prioritize those outside stuff, to put the time in to say, you know what, this isn't benefiting us, but we want to roll it in anyway?
Well, yeah.
So I'd say the first thing is that we are actually, so I will admit, internally at Autodesk, we are super bad at prioritizing cross-team pull request reviews. It's something we are really, so we have this concept of inner source, where we try to take a sort of open source mentality and apply that internal to the company in how we interact with each other in different teams. So we need to learn, we're getting better. But I think it also comes down to priorities. So sometimes when a software company has a pull request up, it might depend on a review from a studio representative, and their priorities will be different. So that's where I was talking about that kind of planning of, do we all agree this thing is a high priority, therefore we're all going to kind of commit resources so that we know when we're starting to work on something, our resource is also going to be available to review and to document and to do the design and to do all those things. Like, I think that's that state we want to get to, but we're not purporting to have the answers yet, because we can still get better internally as well. But within an agile team, we already do that. So in a small team, it's planned into the, like, it's kind of baked into how we work. It's more when agile teams work across each other that we still need to get better and are trying to. But that, I think, is just exacerbated when it's, multiple different organizations working together.
Okay, with that, I would like to thank Doug and Eric.